Hello, everybody. My name is Monsur Hossain. I work for the Google Data APIs team.
And I'm Eric Bidelman. I also work for the Google Data APIs team.
And we're here to talk to you today about using the Google Data APIs and OAuth to create an OpenSocial gadget. If you guys have any questions, feel free to visit this URL we have right here. You could go ahead and post your questions on the Google moderator site, and we'll take a look at them once the session is over. You can also, feel free to ask questions up at the mic once the presentation is over as well. Okay? So our goal today is to build an iGoogle gadget that can read and write user data. So just by a show of hands here, how many people are familiar with gadget development? Okay, good number. What about the Google Data APIs? And how about OAuth? Okay, great. It sounds like a lot of you are familiar with gadgets. That's good because we're not going to cover as much gadget development, and we're going to focus more on the aspects of using OAuth and using the Google Data APIs when building a gadget. Kind of like what we're trying to do here is imagine you have a gadget living on iGoogle, and it's going to want to load data from Blogger. So we're going to talk about how we're actually going to go about grabbing that data from Blogger and also writing data back to Blogger. A lot of the topics that you're going to learn today, you can also apply to other OpenSocial containers and other services that support OAuth. But for the purposes of this talk, we're going to focus on iGoogle and on Google services. So some of the issues you're going to run into is that traditional JavaScript development practices are kind of inadequate for what we want to do. You have issues such as cross-domain communication is really hard to do. We're going to want to load data from Blogger to iGoogle, and it's really hard to talk across domains without doing some sort of iframe hack. Also, even if you could talk cross-domain, you're going to have issues with the data format. Google Data offers a JSON in script format. If you're not familiar with JSON in script, basically what it does is you call JSON in script with a callback function, and it's going to load some JSON onto your page, and it's going to call the callback with that JSON object. This works really well for reading data, but you can't write data back to the servers using this method. Even if there was a good way to do right, you'd need a way to do authentication. The Google Data APIs offer auth-sub and they offer client login, but these authentication mechanisms don't offer as great an experience when being used in a gadget environment. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the Google Data JavaScript client with the OAuth Proxy to create this gadget. So the authentication will be handled by OAuth, while the Google Data JavaScript client will handle the reading and the writing of the data. So just to give you an idea of the technology stack that we're dealing with, on the browser side, on the client side, you're going to have your actual gadget code, which is going to talk to the Google Data JavaScript client, which in turn is going to interface with the OpenSocial JavaScript API, specifically gadgets.io.makeRequest. This is all going to be sent up to the iGoogle server, where it'll be received by the iGoogle server and also processed by the OAuth Proxy to handle the OAuth portion. And finally, that request is going to be sent off to the service provider, which in this case will be Blogger, or if you're using any other Google service, Calendar, Contacts, whatever. So that kind of gives you a sense of the entire technology stack we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background into what OAuth is and how it's used in a gadget environment. So OAuth is an open standard for sharing users' private data with another website or a gadget. When using OAuth, it eliminates the need to have to share passwords between sites. So if you're iGoogle, I don't have to give my password to iGoogle, who in turn gives it off to another site. Instead, what happens is that I get a token, and this token is used to make all authenticated requests. All data requests are digitally signed. So if you're familiar with auth-sub's secure mode, it's very similar to that. So to give a little background about how OAuth works, we're going to start first by looking at the players in this OAuth dance. So first of all, there's the actual user of the gadget, which would be you yourself or anyone else sitting in front of the computer. Next comes the consumer. The consumer is the application that's trying to access the user's data. In our particular case, the consumer is going to be iGoogle, who's going to be requesting the data on behalf of the gadget. Lastly, you have the service provider. The service provider is going to be the keeper of the user's data. In this particular case, it's going to be Blogger, or any other Google service. So these three OAuth players are going to interact in three distinct steps, which is called the OAuth process or the OAuth dance. So the first step is a get request token step. This is a behind-the-scenes request from the consumer to the service provider. The user doesn't see any of this. What's going to happen is that the consumer is going to ask the service provider for a request token. And this request token is going to be used in subsequent requests in the OAuth process. So after obtaining that initial request token, the consumer is going to redirect the user over to the service provider. So once the user is at the service provider site, say once the user is at the Google site, if he hasn't logged in yet, he's going to be asked to log in, and then he's going to be asked to authorize the request token. And what that basically means is that he's going to see a site that says, hey, iGoogle wants to access your data. Do you want to give them permission to use your data? And the user can say yes or no. So we're going to assume, of course, that the user says yes. So what's going to happen is the user clicks authorize, and then the user is redirected back to the consumer site. Now, when the consumer sees that the user has arrived at their site, we have the third step, which is called the get access token step. And this is another behind-the-scenes request from the consumer to the service provider. So what happens is the consumer says, hey, I got this authorized request token. It shows it to the service provider. The service provider says, yes, the user has authorized you to load data. And then it returns back this access token. So this access token is going to be used in all subsequent requests in order to load data from the Google servers. So that's kind of the OAuth process in a nutshell. However, the OAuth process has some issues when being used in JavaScript. First, you've got this issue of crypto. I mean, you can do cryptography in JavaScript, but your user is always going to be able to, or some malicious user is always going to be able to hit, Control U or Command U. They're going to be able to view the source, and at some level, you're always worried that the user can get at your crypto secrets. So there really are no secrets when using JavaScript. The next issue, as I mentioned earlier, is cross-domain. As you saw, the OAuth process has a lot of communications between the consumer and the service provider, and you're going to have a hard time doing that when you're using JavaScript. And lastly, you have the question of storage. You've got all these tokens going back and forth, and where do you store these tokens when you receive them? Do you put them in cookies, or what's the standard way to do that? So in order to address all these issues in JavaScript, we have the OAuth Proxy. The OAuth Proxy it lives in the iGoogle server. It's open source. It goes under the name Shindig if you're familiar with the open source project. And basically what the OAuth Proxy does is it manages the OAuth dance for Gadget. So now with the issue of crypto, we don't have to worry about that because the OAuth Proxy signs the request on behalf of the Gadget. We don't have to worry about cross-domain issues because the OAuth Proxy lives on the same server as the Gadget. So the Gadget can just use XML HTTP requests to talk back to the OAuth Proxy. And lastly, we don't have to worry about storage because the OAuth Proxy is going to manage all the token information for the Gadget. So if you revisit, again, the three steps of the OAuth process that I mentioned earlier, you'll see that the OAuth Proxy is going to handle the request token step and the access token step for you. As a Gadget developer, you'll mostly be concerned with redirecting the user in order to authorize the request token. It lives on the server. So this here's a general skeleton outline of the Gadget module pref section. You'll see we've added, and now we're going to talk about how to enable OAuth in a Gadget environment. So we've got the module pref section. We're going to add a section called OAuth, and we're going to add to that a section named service with the name attribute set to Google, which indicates that we're going to be talking to a Google server. Next, we're going to go ahead and add a specific URL for each of the three steps of the OAuth process. First, we have the request URL. This right here, the google.com/account/OAuth get request token, is standard for doing OAuth against any Google server. However, notice here the scope parameter. What the scope parameter says is it indicates which service your Gadget wants to talk to. In this particular case, the scope is sent to Blogger because we want to get data from the Blogger service. Next, we're going to add the authorization section. And this is basically the URL that the user should visit in order to authenticate and authorize with Google. Notice here we've got the OAuth callback parameter. Basically, when the user is redirected to the authorization URL, they're going to authenticate, they're going to authorize, but once they finish all those steps, the service provider needs to know where to send to the user back on the consumer side. So the service provider is going to send them back to this OAuth callback URL. Lastly, we've got the access token step. This tells the iGoogle server where to visit on the service provider in order to exchange the request token for an access token. So here's what the entire module pref section looks like. And basically with these three URLs, we've laid down the groundwork of doing OAuth in your gadget. Next, Eric's going to come up and talk to you about actually building the gadget.
All right, thanks, man. Thank you, Monsur. So Monsur sort of laid the groundwork on our setup code for a gadget and what we need to do to use the OAuth proxy to talk to one of the Google Data APIs. Now we're going to take a look at some code. We're going to take a look at both the JavaScript required to pull and push data to Blogger, and also the presentation layer, what you sort of need to do to manage these different states, this request token state, this authorization where the user's thrown to Google, and then the access token state. So we'll do that both in OpenSocial using some of the OpenSocial raw APIs, and we'll do that using the Google Data JavaScript client library. We'll take a look at two different ways. I can answer your question real quick. It's on the server, it's the iGoogle server. So the question was, where does the OAuth proxy live? And that's iGoogle. So we defined the mod pref section. In the previous couple slides, we still have the OAuth endpoints there in that OAuth tag. And now we're just requiring the OpenSocial APIs. And then there's a special feature here, this OAuth popup feature. And we'll talk about that. That will provide a great user experience for your users. This is a pop-up window that's going to show the user that they want to access their Blogger data. And then subsequently, when the gadget tries to fetch data when that pop-up window closes, that feature is completely required in here. And lastly, there's just the regular content section. And that's where you're going to be putting presentation, CSS, and possible JavaScript. So let's dive into that. So here's sort of the overall picture of what needs to happen, and we'll take a look at each of these sections. You can see it's relatively few lines of HTML code to get all this working. So the first thing you need to do is sort of add this unauthenticated state, and we're doing this with different div containers. You'll notice that initially we're not displaying any of these, and that's because the gadget's going to have these different states, and we'll take a look at the code behind that in a second. But the approval state is your unauthenticated state. So when the gadget's installed for the first time, the user visits your gadget or their iGoogle page for the first time, and the gadget's installed, they're going to need to authenticate and actually obtain this request token and then go through this OAuth dance like Monsur talked about. So in this case, we're just displaying, sign into Blogger. We'll fill this href with a response that we'll get from the OAuth proxy, and we'll take a look at that code. Next is this pending state, right? You're waiting for the user to go through the approval and actually grant access to your data. So in this case, we're just displaying a link that says, I've approved access. Yeah, the user shouldn't actually see this if you're using that OAuth pop-up feature we just saw, because the gadget will just try to refresh itself, and they'll never actually see this. So the pop-up will go away, and that'll be taken care of for you. But if you don't use the pop-up, you can do something like this and just have the URL and fill it as needed. Next is sort of an authenticated stage. This is sort of the normal operating state of the gadget, so the user already has approved access to their data. And then in this case, we'll just fill it with data, reference its ID and fill it with data once we're authenticated. A couple nice to haves, if anything goes wrong, maybe the user denies access to their data. Maybe you show a meaningful message in some kind of errors div with big red text or something. Another nice to have, display something to the user. Hey, I'm loading data. This gadget's trying to fetch data. I'm trying to post data. Maybe an Ajax loading GIF and some text there. So let's see this in practice. There's actually the Google Data JavaScript client library is a read-write library for web applications, and we'll take a look at this Blogger gadget real quick. So you can see I have this pretty boring blog that I started. I have one post. It's not very interesting. but it was started yesterday, so bear with me. And we'll install this Blogger gadget, and you can see we have that sign into Blogger URL. And if I just refresh the page, you notice the gadget will try to fetch data for the first time. The user's unauthenticated at this point. There's no request token associated with the gadget. So we filled the href with the response we got from the OAuth Proxy. Here's that pop-up window feature that I was talking about. And you can see the I've approved access link, this pending state. So I do trust this gadget with my Blogger data, so I'm going to grant access. We'll be redirected back to the OAuth callback URL. If you use the OAuth callback URL that was in a few slides back, that actually just closes the window using some JavaScript. And the gadget is smart enough to know to refresh itself. And we'll take a look at what exactly went behind that. But you can see there's a relatively painless experience for the user. You know, one pop-up, one click, or a few clicks to grant access. And now the gadget's in its authenticated state. Let me maximize this for you guys. So you can see the gadget refreshed itself, but I have a token. So this is the normal state, right? And it's kind of a nifty gadget. I can choose which blog I want to post to. I can say Google I/O. I can tag this. I can publish that to Blogger. So if all goes well, we should see my new post show up in Blogger, and there you go. So we read data. We read data from Blogger. We got the list of blogs, and then we posted a new entry to Blogger. So how did we do that? By the way, this code is open source at this URL if you're interested. It's blogger_gadget. So how do we load data? For those familiar with the OpenSocial APIs, there's gadgets IO make request. And what's going on with actually inside the Google data libraries, we're wrapping that function with some of the helper methods. And you just pass the URL of the feed you're interested in. You pass a callback function to process the results, the JSON results you get from the response. And then you pass this in optional parameters JSON object. In this case, for the OAuth Proxy and the iGoogle, you're gonna actually need those parameters because we need to tell the OAuth Proxy that we're using OAuth. You need to tell them that we're using tokens. We'll take a look what's required. And again, the OAuth Proxy is handling all this cryptography work for us. All you do is write your OpenSocial calls using make request or using the helper library functions, and it just works, which is great because we like that. So OpenSocial, what does this look like in JavaScript? Pretty simple, right? So the first time the gadget loads, you're going to have a register on load handler, and then we're just going to call some kind of an initialization function. In this case, we're fetching data. So the magic here is we're fetching data. Let's take a closer look at that. Here's the overall picture I just want to show you. You know, it's one slide of code, but it's powerful, right? I'm using this same function in the Blogger gadget to post data to Blogger and also read data. So let's take a look at each section a little more closely. You saw in the example, the first time the gadget loads, we're just showing the animation. We're presenting the user with some kind of meaningful representation that we're doing something in the background. We're setting up a callback function. This callback function is going to process the response JSON from the OAuth Proxy and the iGoogle server. The first time the gadget loads and it's unauthenticated, you're going to get the response object, and there's going to be this OAuth approval URL inside that object. And so that's the sign into Blogger link right there. That's actually the URL that we use to fill that href. So if we have that, we know what state the gadget's in. So we're going to create a pop-up handler, and we'll take a look at that, and just pass that the URL that we want the user to go to. That's the OAuth approval URL. And then we're just going to show the approval state, waiting for the user to make that action. So if we're now actually authenticating, the user has gone through this process, we'll use this same fetchData function, and we'll try to fetch data again. This time we may have a feed object. So in the case of the Google Data APIs, you're going to have a feed object with a bunch of entries, each entry being a blog, post, or a comment, or a title, what have you. We're just going to show those results in that main div there. So relatively straightforward there. Otherwise, there might be an error. Maybe the user denied access again. Maybe there's something wrong with our request. So we'll just show them some kind of meaningful error and show the errors div. So continue on. We have the same code as we had in the previous slide, This is the important section here. This is where we set up the I/O request parameters. So we're talking to Google. Our OAuth service name will be Google. Our method will do a get method to get the list of blogs. Our content type that we're expecting will be JSON from the server. Yes?
Is post supported?
Post is supported, yes. That's how we did the post to Blogger. So we'll take a look at that in a second. The authorization type is OAuth, of course. We're using the OAuth Proxy. And we're always going to be using tokens. So this gadget is accessing private data and also writing data, so you're going to need to be authenticated. And the last thing you want to do is just make that hit that endpoint that you want to talk to. So we're getting a list of blogs, and then we're requesting the results in JSON, and then making the request with the callback we set up here, and then the params hash that we set up here. So the popup handler, the thing that makes this all work. So we saw the sign into Blogger link. That was the first thing when the gadget's been authenticated. We're passing that OAuth approval URL in there. We're creating an on-click handler for that link. Our onOpen function is just going to open that pop-up. We'll show the waiting state. The user will click, grant access. The gadget will refresh itself. The close handler will be invoked. We'll show the loading state. We'll try to fetch data for the first time. And this is sort of the setup code to make all that happen. You can see that now the gadget's fetched data. It's in an authenticated state. And so you're just passing in a height. You're passing in a width for that pop-up URL, and then the two handlers there. So I promised we'd make things a little easier. Like I said, we have a JavaScript client library that sort of takes care of, at least if you're talking to the Google Data APIs, has a lot of helper functionality. It can be used for reading and writing data. It doesn't have to be used in the OAuth Proxy or iGoogle. This can be used in a web application using JavaScript. So we have a special OAuth JS for the JavaScript library. It uses cross-domain communication using some iframe magic. And what we do is we just wrap the gadget's I/O make request. So you can take advantage of the library's helper methods without having to worry about any of the OpenSocial APIs. And there's more information at js-client.bit.ly URL there. So we have the same sort of setup code we had in the OpenSocial world. We have the unregistered handler for when the gadget first loads. We're calling some kind of a init function. But now we have a little more setup to do. What you want to do is you want to load the Google Data Library. So you can include the same common loader that's used in the Maps API, the Earth API, the Ajax libraries. And so we'll load that using the Google.load. We'll load the gdata module, and then we'll optionally specify packages. In this case, this example right here, we'll talk to Blogger and Calendar. You can minimize some overhead by requesting certain packages. You can request the whole library. You can do whatever you want, depending on what your gadget needs or your web app needs. So we'll set an onLoad callback for when the library loads. We're talking to Blogger, so we'll set up a Blogger service object, and we'll pass it the name of our application. It just takes the form of your company name, the name of your gadget, and sort of a version number. Probably the most important line on the slide, if you take anything away from this slide, is this line. This is saying, yes, library, I'm going to be in the OAuth Proxy, and we're going to be using Google as our service provider. Oops. And then the last thing we do is we fetch data like we did in the OpenSocial case. So you can see there's a little more setup code, but you'll save some. In the next slide, you'll see the benefits of this library. Last thing you can do, if you're in a Google Apps domain, you can optionally set the HD parameter to your domain, and that'll provide a more smooth-lined user experience when the user logs in. They won't have to choose which account to log in. They'll just get to your Google Apps login instead. Okay. So we have the same fetch data we had in OpenSocial. We're showing the divs. We're having the same callback function to create the OAuth approval URL and the pop-up. We had the gadget's I/O request parameters before in OpenSocial. We can actually just get rid of all of those. And instead just make the call directly to the feed we're talking to. The feed's default blogs. We're getting the list of blogs. You'll notice we're not appending the alt equals JSON anymore because by default the library uses JSON. So you can just hit that endpoint directly, and then instead of calling gadgets IO_make_request, you can just use one of the library's helper functions. So, get blog feed in this case, and we're passing it the URL. It's important to note that the callback that will process the results from the server and the error handler is this same callback, because we're fetching data when the gadget loads and also when they come back from the approval page. So we're going to use this same URL to do both. The same function to do both. So creating data. As I said, the library can be used to read and write data using JavaScript. So in that Blogger example, what I did was I had just a post data method. Right, we're passing in a blog that we want to post to, and then we're just setting up a new entry. In this case, a Data Blogger blog post entry, and it's just JSON. So we're setting a title. We're setting content, a couple categories, maybe for labels, and optionally, if we want to mark that Blogger entry, that new post as a draft or not. So we'll reference that new library in the Blogger insert entry function. The link we'll post to is the blog's edit link, the entry post link, and then we'll reference that new entry that we just created out here, and we'll have a handle insert method and a handle error method, and those are on the next slide. So just for your reference, this is how we actually got this red blog here. We just did, remember the get blog feed with the blog list URL. We processed that response from the server and just posted to the first entry we found, the first entry being the first blog. So a little cleaner than the OpenSocial world if you're using Google Data APIs. This code would be much more verbose if you're using OpenSocial. Obviously, you can't take advantage of the library's functions if you're not using the library. And the library does the JSON to XML, to Atom XML back to JSON for you. We'll do questions at the end. The handle insert and handle error methods, both pretty simple, right? We're just displaying the link to the blog we posted to the user. This is the entry that was posted. You'll get that in the response from the server. And the HTML link is the actual link to the blog. So if you visit in the website, that would be the same URL there. The handle error method is just presenting, a meaningful alert message to the user saying something went wrong, or the server doesn't understand your entry, or whatnot. So I think I'm going to hand it back to Monsur now, who's going to talk a little bit more about what's going behind the scenes and how all of this OAuth Proxy magic is happening. Monsur.
All right, thanks, Eric. So we saw a little bit about how to set up your gadget, and I'm going to talk about what's going on behind the scenes. So, we have this single line from the JavaScript client, basically with the URL, and we have our two handlers. In our particular example, the handlers are the same, but they could also be different. You can have a success handler and an error handler. And then basically, these are going to get wrapped up, and it's going to call gadgets.io.makeRequest like we saw earlier. So here we have the gadgets.io.makeRequest call. Notice the modified callback here. Gadgets.io.makeRequest only accepts one callback. So what the Google Data JavaScript client does is it takes that success callback and that error callback and wraps it into one, and then it dispatches it accordingly, whether it gets a successful result or an error result. Also notice we have the OAuth parameters here, which Eric also showed us earlier. So that also gets filled in for you because the JavaScript client understands, for example, whether or not it's doing a get or a post, and all the rest of the variables are pretty much the same. So what happens is this gadget.io.makeRequest is going to end up making an XML HTTP request back to the iGoogle server. So that XML HTTP request is always going to be a post. That's just the way that the makeRequest call works. Notice here it's on the gmodules.com domain, which is basically the same domain that the gadget lives on. Within this post, you're going to have a couple items in the body of the request. For example, you have the URL, which is going to be the URL you want to make the request to. You've got the original HTTP method, any post data that goes along with it, and so on and so forth. So basically, when the iGoogle server, this is all going to go to the iGoogle server. When it receives this request, it's going to basically unwind the request and say, okay, this is a request that needs to go to blogger.com, it needs to be a GET request, and so on. And it's actually going to make this request to Blogger. When Blogger gets this request, it has one of two possible responses. It could say, oh, I've got the OAuth token here, everything's in good shape, here's the Blogger data for the user. However, if the user isn't logged in using OAuth, then the Blogger server is going to say, hey, wait a minute, this user doesn't have permissions yet, and it's going to send back a failure response. And that failure response looks something like this. So it's going to be a JSON object, and all the requests, all the responses back to gadgets.io.makeRequest are going to be JSON objects. However, notice that the body of this response is empty. And instead of a body, we have this OAuth approval URL here. And the OAuth approval URL is going to be the same URL that we saw in step 2 of the OAuth process. And it's going to be the pop-up that the gadget's going to show in order for the user to authorize with. So your gadget's going to see this OAuth approval URL, and as Eric's code showed earlier, it's going to show the pop-up accordingly. So once the user authenticates, authorizes, the gadget's going to try to make the request again. And this time, since the user is properly authorized, they're going to get back a successful response from the Blogger server. And a successful response is going to look something like this. You still have the JSON object, but in the body field, you actually have the JSON of the Blogger response. So that's going to have your feeds and your entries and all that kind of stuff. And so that's kind of a sense of what's going on behind the scenes. And Eric's going to talk about a few more demos.
I'll stay up here. So we saw Blogger gadget, but there's 14, 15, 16 Google Data APIs now, analytics and the Maps Data API being the latest 2 additions. So we can talk to any of these APIs using, or any as mentioned by Monsur, any OAuth service provider for that matter using OpenSocial. So there's a base example we can show, and there's also a calendar gadget we can show. So just as an example for calendar, I've used the same sort of logic and setup code, my content, my divs, and then the sign into calendar link. Using the same create popup handler, this time we're accessing the calendar scope in that OAuth request URL instead of the Blogger's scope. We'll grant access. And it's not a very interesting gadget. It just gives a list of this test accounts, list of calendars. But it's literally the same idea for any of these APIs using the JavaScript client library. I think I wrote this in probably 5 minutes as I ported over the Blogger gadget. So just to show you how easy it is and how versatile it is. Another example, using Google Base. And you'll notice I didn't have to approve access to this one because Google Base actually has public feeds. This does use the JavaScript client library, but I didn't have to go through the OAuth dance. So just as another sort of example of things you can do, this gadget uses settings. So I'm searching for software job titles around the Mountain View area, that are 75,000 and above. So if I save those settings, we'll get some results, and each of these is just one of the entries in Base that somebody's posted. And there's pagination in the Google data feed, so you can paginate through these results. So you can provide some pretty powerful gadgets using the library in little or no time. And both of those are open sourced at those 2 URLs there if you're interested in the source code. All right, to wrap things up. We saw a lot of technology today. We introduced OAuth. We talked a little bit about OAuth and the basics behind it. We talked about OpenSocial, how to set up a gadget to use the OAuth Proxy and iGoogle to talk to the Google Data APIs. Then we saw the same sort of JavaScript to talk to the Google Data APIs using the JavaScript client library. We talked about how the OAuth Proxy, Monsur talked about how the OAuth Proxy handles these requests for us, and we don't have to worry about any crypto, token management whatsoever. We just literally call the APIs. We post data, we update data, we delete data from the APIs. And then we talked about the server side of things a little bit. So as always, we have a great list of resources for you. There's information on the JavaScript client library and how you can use that within a web app or the OAuth Proxy and iGoogle in the gadget space. There's a comprehensive article on writing OAuth gadgets. This is all sort of the OAuth goodness and the OAuth Proxy goodness in that article there. And there's code samples. There's example gadgets. There's example web apps that you can get quickly started with in the different APIs if you're interested. All right, so I think we have a Google moderator link, and again, it's IO OAuth gadgets, If you would like to ask questions on moderator, feel free to also step to the mic so we can hear you too on the video. And we'll also be available afterwards if you want to come up and talk to us.
Thank you for a great presentation.
Thank you.
A several-part question. We saw the ability to post and also read the contents of a blog. How about searching into that blog on a particular discussion thread and reading from within that discussion thread or posting to inside that discussion thread as just generally to the blog? Is that their ability? And second question is, how does OAuth integrate, given the fact that, for instance, for enterprises, we have our own AD or internal LDAP? Does it integrate, given that OAuth is hosted by iGoogle? And how? Or do we now have to create two different users' accounts on two separate systems, separated from each other?
So I can answer your first one, because I remember that one. So you can do, using OAuth and three-legged OAuth, as we saw in the examples, you can do anything the APIs can do. So in the case of Blogger, yes, you can post comments. You can retrieve the comments. Each blog has a comments feed that you can use to get that, and then post and update comments and whatnot. And same thing with the other APIs. So anything you can do in the APIs using the server, you can do using OAuth in the OAuth proxy.
So that means that you have search capability within the blog. So for instance, you can key on for certain words, you can sort that, and you can display it in a certain form. Is that built into the protocol, or is that something you have to handle in your code?
Yeah, so
Probably something you have to handle in your code. I mean, the APIs expose underlying functionality that Blogger itself exposes. So, I mean, there isn't really a way to do that. I mean, you need basically to grab the entries yourself and then add that capability on it yourself.
So yeah, and I'll just add that each of the APIs has its own query model. The Google Data Protocol has a standard set of protocol parameters that you can use to search like full text and title, search on title and full text. I'm not sure what Blogger actually supports, if they support full text search on the body of the contents of the
So
of the
there's
blog.
no like jQuery support or anything like that?
No,
No, okay.
no, different protocol.
And for your second question, so within your firewall, are you yourself running the iGoogle server or the OpenSocial server? See, if you're hosting it all internally, then you'd be able to configure the OAuth proxy yourself. And
So if we were to host it internally, then does it have an interface to AD? Does it have an interface to LDAP, where it can actually go and ask for credentials from that system and pull them into OAuth?
Right, yeah.
Or do we still have to enter into two separate siloed systems?
Yeah, I don't believe that sort of capability is there right now. So yeah, users would have to authenticate with OAuth as long as a separate kind of interaction with the gadget.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the third-party servers that you have for the OAuth. Do you have an estimate as to what percentage of the gadgets that you have are powered by third-party servers, or is it mostly Google stuff?
Do you mean gadgets in general?
Or like service providers, OAuth service providers?
Exactly. OAuth service providers.
No idea the stats off the top of my head, but I know for a fact that I've created a number of different OAuth service provider gadgets. MySpace, Netflix has an OAuth API, Twitter has an OAuth API, and you can what you can do is you can register. Actually, on that article explains the Writing OAuth Gadgets article explains how to register a gadget that doesn't talk to talk to Google. So if you're talking to say MySpace, you register your consumer key and consumer secret with us. I think it's just an email, and then you can use one of their APIs or their OAuth endpoints instead of Google's. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. What if I wanted to implement my own OAuth server? Is there a service that I can go to help me do that, or do I have to set up my server that does the implementation? I mean, you mentioned MySpace and Twitter. And
yeah, if you wanted to actually issue tokens and be a service provider, As far as, I think there's a few maybe open source projects that use App Engine to do that, and maybe you can look at that code.
You could also, if you go to OAuth.net,
Yes.
there's a bunch of open source libraries that you could use depending on what language you're programming in.
Right.
And I think most of them handle both server and client side of doing OAuth.
So really
So
what I
it's
want to
feasible.
do is give users of my gadget access to their data that's stored on my server using OAuth, as opposed to on Blogger or MySpace.
Right.
Okay.
Definitely. Yeah, and like Monsur said, those libraries have server code as well as client code. So, should we go to moderator? Where can we find guidance for integrating GData APIs into non-web clients, e.g. .NET apps on Windows?
So if you go to the main, what's the link again? If you go to the main Google Data APIs site,
Yeah.
it's code.google.com/API/GData. Under the docs section, and right here on the left-hand side, there's a client libraries link. This will kind of give you an idea of all the client libraries that are available under GData. So there's Java, .NET, JavaScript, PHP, Python, Objective-C. So you kind of got a sense of all the libraries we provide right there. So that's a good place to start. And it's documentation, samples, and reference guides for all our client libraries. All right. Okay. Are there any other questions?
All right, well, thank you. We know this is the last session of the day, so thanks for coming.
Thank you.